And I think without further ado, I'm going to step down and I'm going to hand over the microphone to our keynote speaker, who it is my great pleasure to welcome here. It's her first time here, and we had to bribe her with many yummy things to get her to come. And that is Salima Ikram, who many of you have seen on Discovery Channel, Nova, National Geographic, all over. And you probably know any one of her many books, Divine Creatures and her new Introduction to Ancient Egypt, as well as one that just came out with Aidan Dotson, and I could go on and on and on. She's going to be doing a presentation and a short demonstration for which a sacrifice was made this morning. And she will be speaking from the Meadow to the Em-baa-lming table on experimental archaeology and mummification. And I should warn you, some of the images in this presentation are graphic. Thank you.
So I would very much like to thank the Swansea group for the invitation, and in particular Kasha for all of her hard work, and Wendy, and also Reg for putting my bowl together when I had a capa's cough, and Jane for... Press the button? Not working? See, I bellow so well. Everyone else can hear me. Right, now is that all right? Okay, thank you. So very much thanks to both the university and the Egypt Centre, and also to Kasha and to Wendy for organising everything so beautifully, and to Ken and to Reg, who has been doing stellar work because part of my demonstration smashed in my suitcase. So we will deal with that as it comes up. And also to Jane, who is a vegetarian but was sent to do sacrificial work. So many thanks to all concerned. And also I'd like to thank Geoffrey Killen, who helped start me with experimental archaeology and helped my thesis get done, and unbeknownst to him also has helped greatly with the presentation you are about to see now. So now if anyone's a soft-stomached person, you might want to miss this and come back for the next lecture. So you are warned. As you know, I'm going to talk about animal mummies. Animal mummies are found... Can we put the lights down, please, so that people can see the images better? Is that possible, Kasha? Because otherwise it's very, very faint. Anyway, animal mummies are found at the length of the Nile Valley in Egypt and also in its oases, as you can see here. And this map gives you a sense of the density of animal mummies and their locations. Now, an animal mummy is, or mummy, is an artificially preserved body of a human, or in this case, an animal. And my emphasis is on artificial, because you do get natural mummies or bog bodies and this, that, and the other, or frozen people, but they, in my mind, do not constitute a proper mummy. So it has to have human intervention. Now, the reason I got interested in animal mummies is because, well, when I was little, I went to visit the animal mummy room in the Egyptian Museum, and it obviously made a lasting impression. And then I came up with a project, because the room had been closed for some years, to reopen it and reinstall the animal mummies and restudy them, because they had really only been studied in 1902, and a publication had emerged in 1905. And since then, many other mummies had been added to the collection, and for some reason or the other, in the late 80s, the room had been shut. So in the 1990s, I started working on there, and this is our reinstalled animal mummy room at the Egyptian Museum, and I very much hope you go and visit it when you have time. Now, what emerged from the work was basically that there are 4 different kinds of animal mummies. The most understandable to us are pet mummies. The ancient Egyptians loved their pets, as we do today, and they wanted to make sure that these creatures came with them to the afterlife. And so they mummified them, they placed them in their tombs, or they gave them tombs of their own with their own sarcophagi, coffins, grave goods, and so forth. The second type of animal mummies is very Egyptian, and those are food offering, victual mummies. Food mummies are mummies, as you might expect, so that you can eat in the afterlife. And they would be prepared so that they were ready for consumption. So it's like when you go to Sainsbury's or Tesco's and there is that roast chicken that you can take home and eat. Of course, bearing in mind that we have no chickens in ancient Egypt in the Pharaonic period, but you have all sorts of things here. You have legs of lamb or cow. You have poultry, all sorts of things that have been plucked, flayed, cooked to some degree, and prepared so that they are snackable in the afterlife. Tutankhamun, who was a growing boy, as a teenage boy, you can imagine that he had to have quite a few of these, and so he had over 42 boxes of food mummies in case he got hungry. The third type of animal mummy are the sacred animals, and these are creatures that were regarded as being gods on earth, and the thought was that during the lifetime of the animal, a fragment of the god, in this case you see here a ram, so Khnum, would enter into the body of this particularly well-marked, whether it's, by the color or the shape of the horns or what have you. It would enter into the body of this beast. During the lifetime of the animal, it would be prayed to, it would have oracular powers, it would be sort of fussed over, sung to, and offerings would be made to it. After its demise, it would be mummified and with great pomp and circumstance and buried in a very large and elaborate way. Then the spirit of the god, of course, would enter into the body of another animal. It's a bit like the Dalai Lama, so it's using different bodies which can be recognized, but the essential Ba spirit is the same. And the last type of animal mummy we have are votive mummies, and these are the most plentiful. We have hundreds and thousands, actually probably millions, of different votive mummies in Egypt, and indeed in the Egypt Center, I believe, you have some votive mummies as well. And these were, instead of lighting a candle, which one does in a church, which of course you light the candle, and then when it goes out, the smoke takes your prayers off to God. The Egyptians didn't believe in the short term. They wanted the long-term kind of thing, so they made animal mummies, because then the mummy would take your message, your prayer, to the divinity, and of course because the animal itself was in the image of the divinity, so you would have cats for the goddess Bastet, you would have falcons for Ra or Horus, ibises for Thoth. The god would be more willing to listen to his own creature, and so the idea was that through your life, and indeed after your death, your prayers and your presence would be noted by this particular divinity, who would be paying attention to his own or her own creature, and therefore you would have much more attention being paid to you for the afterlife. And these particular kinds of offerings are more common from the 26th dynasty onwards, and were very much an Egyptian thing to separate themselves out from all the foreign elements that kept coming into Egypt thereafter. These animal mummies are buried in a variety of places. You have them in catacombs, sometimes just in pits. Here you have the Bubastion at Saqqara. Here you have the Serapeum also at Saqqara. This is a model of the Bucaeum, where you have all the sacred bull mummies being buried, and you can see that the sacred animals, each one got a sort of loculus in which it was put. So you have these alleyways with flanking tombs. Sometimes we have it in a bit more chaotic manner. Here you can see Tuna el Gebel, where we have a bunch of pots which used to contain ibis mummies, and these are the dog catacombs being excavated by Dr. Paul Nicholson, who will be speaking on later, and it just gives you a sense that these were mummies that were thrown in or placed, but not with as much elaborate preparation as the ibises, and you can see that everything has disintegrated, leaving us with a great many bones. All sorts of animals have been represented. We even have heifer beetles, and ranging from, the teeny weeny heifer beetle all the way to very large crocodiles. But you have catfish, you have ibises, you have gazelle, you have cattle, and also things like shrews, and going down to bundles of feathers and things, which some people regard as fake mummies, but are in actual fact not real falseries. They're the detritus of mummification, and anything associated with mummification and the sacredness has been gathered together and wrapped up and is being put as an offering, or maybe just to keep it safe because it was once associated with something sacred and divine. Now, why do we study animal mummies? For a long time, people didn't. In fact, animal mummies were thrown away, used as ballast and shipped, ground up and used as fertilizers, as close to us as Liverpool, and were generally thought of nothing much more than curiosities. But when you look at animal mummies, you can study climate and environment, the different species that were extant in ancient Egypt, many of which are now extinct. You learn about veterinary practices, religious and cultural beliefs, technology, and trade. And technology is, of course, what we're going to talk about today. And trade is also important because, remember, when you mummify things, you are using stuff like resins, which comes from afar. And these are very important to your economy and trade because they're expensive items that have to be imported into Egypt. Now, generally, how do we study animal mummies? Of course, we do things like X-rays, which are as well as CT scans. And these are some X-rays of things that Don Ryan has found in KV60. One can also look at sites that were associated with mummification. This is at Memphis. This is supposed to be associated with the Apis embalming rituals, and it is one of the embalming beds. This is another one at Tun el-Jebel, where you notice all of this black material is poured over things. This is an embalming bed, and these are various things associated with. Please bear in mind the technical term for the black substance that you see here. It is called goo, because we don't, until you test it, until you know whether it's resin or oil or anything else, we will refer to it in a very technical sort of an honest way. But this is probably where, just before the animal mummy was consecrated, they would pour libations of oil over it and then march it down to the catacombs at the final burial point, because these animal mummies were put into, as votive offerings, into these catacombs dedicated to the gods. Now, of course, the last way of studying animal mummies is also to do experimental archaeology, because then we can learn a lot about how they were made, the economy of making them, and also how to recognize sites by the debitage at these various places. So with experimental mummification, we can learn about the ingredients that are used by using texts which have lists of things that embalmers wanted to use, or in fact embalmers' bills. So you think, why the hell do they have alum in here, is one of the questions I had. And also we can try and work out the methodology for this. Components of an embalming area, and of course the different steps of mummification might require different kinds of spaces. So are there architectural elements that are necessary? Are there environmental elements that are necessary? What kind of the physicality of the actual act? So the placement of all of these objects, how you would be able to reconstruct an embalming area, how you yourself could carry this out, and all the complexities associated therein. So, of course, this led me to do experimental work. Some of the earliest work I did was on rabbits, and here you see Flopsy over there. Oh, sorry, this is Mopsy, who was eviscerated and exsanguinated. And then we tried, this is Peter, who is being eviscerated, and then we made a little slit in his side and used natron bags there. And this is Peter again being wrapped up with bandages inscribed with parts of the appropriate spells. You can see these are the results of my early experiments that were made with my students. Mopsy is the big jive bunny because we weren't used to how this was going to be done. Now, as you know, a mummy is a desiccated creature, and basically what happens when one mummifies is for human beings, you're supposed to remove the brain. For animals, we don't bother doing that. Because most of the animals, bless you, I've ever had, when you rattle their heads, you can hear the rattling of the brain, so you know that the brain is left in. So that's why we ignored that, even for larger animals such as cattle, which is a bit surprising. But anyway, and here are some of my other early experiments. Now today I'm going to talk to you about doing just to show you that the animals are worshipped, people come and make offerings to them, and they are very well regarded. Many carrots have been left at their doors. Now, other things that we can learn about animal mummification is how they were reared, where they were reared, how the animals were killed, because a lot of them, especially votive animals I have found by looking at them through x-rays, is that cats in particular, their heads are sometimes bashed in or their necks are broken. With puppies, I think what happens is that they are taken away from their mothers at a young age when they're not even quite weaned. So 3-week-old, 4-week-old puppies, and that's how they die because they starve, which is a bit unfortunate because we tend to think of Egyptians as being kind to animals, but at the same time they had this sort of dichotomy and paradox in the way they dealt with them. We know that at some sites, I found with my rabbit, because at the same time I was doing a duck, we found that they can be, many animals might have been produced in the same atelier or workshop. And it is very important for us to do the whole experimental archaeology thing because we experience things as the way the ancients do, and we learn in the same way they did by a series of apprenticeships almost as to how mummification takes place. Now, the rabbit mummies, of course, answered several questions I had about mummification, but there were some unanswered questions, so we carried out more experimentation, and that's why we have moved on to larger creatures, which I'm going to talk about today, which are sheep. This is Brownie, who is a sheep, and she was killed, obviously, to give her life over not just to science, but also to Gnome, in a way. Now, the first thing, of course, after the animal has been killed is to eviscerate it. I was very fortunate to have some implements being made by Dr. Kellen. Jeffrey Kellen has done these very nice embalming things. I was going to bring them, but I'm afraid that if I'd checked them in my luggage, they might have been lost, and obviously hand luggage was not an option because I would have menaced people. I already had a hard time getting into the country. So anyway, thank you, Jeffrey, because I actually used these implements on the sheep. These are embalming knives. And as I said, I ignored the extraction of the brain, and then I opened up the belly of Brownie. And first what you have to do is you have to shave a little bit of the fur. Now, of course, on the belly there isn't as much of the woolly stuff as there is everywhere else, but that is something to take into consideration. And then we cut. Now, obviously, when you're doing this, it wouldn't just be one embalmer doing everything. This is Louise, my assistant, and you really need, in fact, a team of people. Now, imagine if you were doing an apis bull. The bull would be twice the size of this table almost. So they're big, hefty creatures. So the people, you would have to have people who had a lot of upper body strength. Luckily for me, Louise lifts weights. I do not. We had an interesting time actually doing this thing. So cutting it is fine. You know, you have people holding the legs to give you access to this. And you can see over here the cut being made. Now, the upper body strength really comes into play when you have to remove the internal organs, which is the next step. Now, think of it. Cattle and sheep and all of these other creatures have more than one stomach. Now, unless you starve them before they die, the stomachs are full. So having to haul that out and carry it is really a very, very difficult thing. And then you think of canopic jars. they're kind of small, and if you look at the holes inside, they're very tiny. And I've often wondered, you know, how does it all fit? Well, the thing you have to do is you have to sort of empty out the intestines and the stomach, and when you're pulling it out, if you're, particularly for humans, if you have a very small cut, you have to sort of hack and pull and hack, and it's not a very dignified procedure, I have to say, as you extract all the internal organs. And then there is often quite a bit of blood lying around, and then what is really most effective is if you and your team of people, particularly for larger animals, you have to turn the animal over. So it's a very physically involved activity, and then you hold it and you thump it and the blood comes out. So obviously all of these activities would have been taking place outside, where the sun would also have lots of UV light to help make sure things were not getting too disgusting and infectious. And here you go. The internal organs, I mean, they do shrink a lot, but again, the intestines and the stomach need to be cleaned out, and it is rather an odoriferous process. So either if you were an embalmer, you would be inured to this, or else you'd be sort of putting some kind of balm or resin over here, as we did, so that we wouldn't be unwell. Then what you do is you wash the interior with water. So you have to have a water source nearby, you pour the water in, and then we found the best thing was that if Louise took the forelegs and I took the hind legs, we picked it up and we sloshed it about. If you are doing the Apis bull, it needs to be much bigger and you need more people trying to do this. So it is really a very physical thing, and this also explains why some of the embalming tables in Memphis are so low. The Egyptians were like me, the ancient Egyptians, tended to be shorter than longer. So it actually, the embalming table for someone like me is of the right size to wander around, and people could even easily climb up to it if you want to get better purchase on your animal. Now, after we do that, the ideal was, according, and we use Herodotus to some extent, you're supposed to use palm wine. And unfortunately, I could not get my hands on palm wine for love of money. So instead, we went for local gin, which was very good because in between when we wanted to smell something refreshing, or be encouraged by what we were doing, we could have a source for it. So anyway, then you pour the palm wine or the gin into the body cavity, and again, you do that, and then you have to stick your hand in and you have to scrub a bit to make sure you get the blood and all the little bits and pieces of internal organ that's residual or soft tissue out. After you've done that, you take your linen cloth and you mop. A lot of the linen that was used in mummification were old rags, and so you can imagine that the embalmers and the rag trade people had a great deal of interaction and activity. So you spend a lot of time sort of mopping it out because you want to dry it, because the whole point of making a mummy is desiccation. After you have done your best with drying it, using the linen, which by the way is very expensive nowadays, what you have to do next is to desiccate. Now, as you all know, the chief desiccant used by the ancient Egyptians was natron, which occurs naturally in the Wadi Natrun, some 40 kilometers from Cairo. And this is what it looks like when you get it from the Wadi Natrun, and we'll have this over here at the table so that you can fondle it if you like. Then to break it up to make it a fine powder. Luckily I was not arrested. I would have liked to have brought much more for you so we could have done mummification here. But you can grind it into a fine powder, as you see over here. And if you sieve it several times, so depending on the kind of quality of mummification you're doing, it would be not only pounded but also sieved to give you the purest of natron. Now, for the internal organs, and this I learnt the hard way from my bunny, was that you have to take pieces of linen and make little bags of these. And these are actually bags, examples of bags that we found in KV63, which was an embalming deposit. And so some of them are larger, some of them are smaller, some of them are in sausage shapes, depending on where you're putting them on inside the body. So you may put natron into the little piece of cloth and you tie it up and you knot it as you see here. and then you put it into the body, because this means that you can, and then you bury the entire body inside natron. And here you can see the natron bags being made by my students. And so you have to have a production line. Either they're made in advance, or you have a group of junior embalmers sitting there practicing making these bags. And when you look at them from embalming caches, you in fact can tell when the same person has made them, because you knot them the same way. So you really can get the fingerprint of the artisan, which is quite delightful. Now, once you have these, you put them into the body. And the reason to have them is because if you put plain natron into the body, what happens is it gets wet very quickly and very smelly, and it's very difficult to take out. Because the first rabbit I did, we did that, and we had many people being sick from the roof of the biology building, which was unfortunate. And I don't think professionals do that. And so we went for these bags. And as I said again, sometimes you put the sausage-shaped ones because they get into the hard-to-reach places. And so once you stuff that, you bury it inside natron. So you sort of lay down a bed of natron, you put the creature on it, and then you cover it over with natron. Now, if you're doing a good job, you have enough natron. We had to use over 300 kilos of natron, and it was not enough. Really, if you're going to do a good job for a sheep, you would need about 450 kilos of natron. And this is reusing the natron, because what happens is, as you all know, Bob Breyer did this experiment with a human being. And Bob's person took almost 240 days to dry, and he wasn't a very fat man. Now, remember, we're dealing with a sheep with a big bunch of fat back here. It's a fat-tailed sheep. Which is problematic, because what natron does is it desiccates as well as defats. But anyway, so what Bob did not do was change the natron, and I found that you have to change the natron, because what does natron do? Sucks out all of the wetness, right? And if you leave it there, then it's just wet around the body, so it's not going to desiccate properly. So what you really need to do is to change the natron. And initially, in the first 3 weeks, or 2.5 weeks, if you change the natron every 3 to 4 days, you get a beautiful mummy. And I'm sure 18th dynasty royalty was made with regular changes in natron because they are so superior. A lot of the other mummies I have looked at, particularly from later periods, are not as well made, because particularly in the late period where you get a lot of the animal mummies from, they just leave them there, and then they sort of hope that the rest of it will make it look all right, and they put in fake arms and legs and other bits and pieces. Anyway, here is Brownie, buried under. Now, what we tried with Brownie, you notice that she's not buried like this. We positioned her while she was still flexible and tied her up, which of course, though, makes these corners and crevices which are hard to desiccate. The work was carried out on the Egyptology roof. Here are my students who are doing the work with me, and you can see this. We changed the natron inside and out several times over the weeks. We had rain. Now, you can't always make your mummy in the summer. And in ancient Egypt, as we know, it did rain, and probably in certain time periods, such as the Middle Kingdom, look at the Mecca models with all the rain spouts, it rained more often. So what did the embalmers do? Did they have temporary shelters, or did they suddenly run out when there was a rain cloud approaching and throw up temporary shelters on the wood? Because that is something, the environment is something to take into consideration. Unfortunately, we didn't have a way of doing much more than covering it like this, although Brownie did get wet twice. We noticed that despite our changing of the natron, because we didn't have enough, you really need this much to cover the body, flies get in everywhere. And so we had maggots and larvae, which were eating away at the flesh. We also had domestic beetles. That's a domestic beetle wandering around, which, of course, domestic beetles are flesh eaters, which is very useful when we are making skeletons for our comparative collection of animal anatomy, but not so good when you're making a mummy. And And indeed, when I have examined mummies of different periods, I have found bits of fly larvae as well as domestic beetle larvae, and indeed a few dead domestids stuck in there. You can see that her coat is not doing very well, but we were trying. This is us changing the interior bags of natron, and this just gives you a sense of how Brownie was positioned and tied up with her linen bandage so that she would be easy to wrap when we came to that point. And again, you can reuse the natron. What we would do is once we'd used the natron to some extent, we'd take it, we'd put it out in the sun to dry, toss it over, and then put it in. And of course, we were also doing at the same time one fish and one cat that had died in a car accident. And we tried to nurture it, but it had passed on, so we decided to make Kate Cat sort of eternal. But what you find is that when you're changing the natron, you get bits of the feather, or well, not feathers in this case, but scales, as well as the fur from the different animals. And when you wrap or unwrap a mummy, rather, you find sometimes there are all sorts of weird things inside. Being Egyptologists, generally, we think, oh, ritual purpose. But now, no, it's actually a practical problem from the whole mummification process. It's an artifact that is not deliberate. When you find a fish scale sometimes in your cat mummy, it's because they were probably producing fish mummies nearby. This just gives you sort of a sense of this whole thing. One embalmers must have smelt a very special way for much of the time, because even when you wash, the whole smell of natron and death really does impregnate your pores, and no matter how much one scrubs, it lasts for a couple of days thereafter. Now, this is just to show you some of my maggots, which were quite plentiful, and no matter how hard we covered these things, we found that the flies managed to go in and lay their eggs, which was a bit problematic. And that's a close-up of one of these things. Now, Polly the raptor, this is a real ancient Egyptian mummy that we excavated at Abydos. Actually, in the body cavity, I found all of these pupae. So you can see that this is something that the embalmers from ancient times struggled with as well when they weren't covering their creatures with sufficient amounts of natron. So obviously, when you were doing econobuy kind of mummification, this is something that was very prevalent. And those are sort of a close-up. So you can see that this happened in the ancient as well as the modern period. You notice that a lot of the fur has fallen off, and we found that in some instances, some of the bones, some of the smaller bones, were shaking loose. Because when you moved Brownie, you could hear them rattle, which is quite interesting, because when you are looking at animal mummies from the late period, you do find that sometimes bits and pieces are loose. They're wrapped very beautifully to give you the idea that they are well preserved, but internally they're not quite as well done as they ought to be. And in fact, at some points we found maggots eating holes into the flesh, which was a great problem. Even after 25 days, and you know that the desiccation process should take 40 days, with the sheep, particularly towards the rear, we found where all the fat is, we found that the natron was still very, very wet. And even after 35 days, the natron around the bottom was very, very wet. So obviously doing early caprids or sheep which have fat-tailed sheep, it would have taken a little bit longer if you were going to do it properly. However, if you were going to stick to the rule of 40 days, then that explains why a lot of these mummies are not as well made, because they just were too fat. That just shows you some of the blood and guts that were associated with the internal natron bags. Changing of the bags, passing of the bags. We kept doing this burying, unburying, and you can also see this gives you a sense of the craquelure that appears on the surface of the natron as it sucks out the moisture and the fats from the body. After giving it a bit longer than its established time period, we decided that we would do more, time was up, the semester was almost over, it had had more than 55 days, and it was time to wrap it up. So the whole process for making the sheet took much longer than expected. The cat, which was a tiny little thing, worked very much. It was in fact ready before its 40-day periods, but we gave it its 40 days. And, sorry, it was 56 days of desiccation that this brownie took. So here we are. Once you've done the desiccation, you take it up, you remove all the natron, you thump it a bit to rid it of the natron, and then it was moved down to the lab. We wiped it off. We didn't really use anything wet, but we tried to brush it down to remove all of this natron from it, or for the most of it. And this is what it looked like at this point. And then you start the 30-day ritual of oiling and wrapping. The oiling, of course, the 7 sacred oils are supposed to be sacred, and they're supposed to have a magical purpose. They also have a practical purpose, because if you have really successfully dried out the body, it's very brittle and things snap off. And therefore, when you're wrapping, if you manipulate it, it will shatter into bits. So what you need to do is oil it, but carefully, just the right amount. And that's why they take 30 days to do it, because you do a little bit and you see what happens, really. And at the same time, priests are saying the right prayers. So you are making it, revivifying it very slowly, both physically as well as spiritually and magically. Then we do the wrapping. After the thing, because also when you do this you can reposition it much better, because remember Brownie had already been somewhat positioned, but this made us ease her into the traditional pose much better. So the oiling goes on, and you can see us slathering oils. We don't know precisely what the 7 sacred oils are. We use lettuce oil, castor oil, and a few other oils that are produced and we know from ancient Egypt. You can see how, it darkens the coat once again, and sometimes lends luster to the fleece. Now, after this has been done, you also use resin, because in the reports that we have, as well as what is written in text, we know that resin is being used. Now, one of the nice things particularly we found with the resins, when you melt the resin, and it's pure resin, and you pour it over the body takes on a golden sheen. And of course, once you're dead, you are becoming an Osiris, you're becoming a god. And your flesh is being transformed from being meat to being something more sublime, gold. And the resin is a physical manifestation of this transformation between one media and the other. So, but a lot of the late period animal mummies look all black and gooey, which is what gives them their name mumia. And what basically happens is that oil has been added to the resin. Now with Brownie, I didn't add that much oil, but subsequently to test some of the Brownie questions I had, I have done a fish. And when you put a lot of oil in, the resin pours beautifully, but immediately covers it, but is black. And what you have to make sure is, we found after Brownie, which worked well on the fish, is after the last oiling, you leave it for about 7-8 days for the oil to be absorbed, but not to be so slippery that when you pour on the resin, it all falls off. So that's a very key part of this. This is us melting resin. It means, of course, also that they must have had fires burning at all time, because if you remove the resin pot from the stove, and I'm sorry we're not using proper materials such as a cooking pot made of pottery and an open fire, but unfortunately even we have health and safety regulations. But you have to keep it hot all the time, and you have to keep stirring. If you add the oil, it makes it viscous and speeds up the process of melting. We used frankincense and myrrh, which is upper level mummification. Please come and feel free to handle some when you want. And then you pour it over the body. It's very important to put it over the internal organs, but this gives you a sense of sort of the golden color that it has. This is not mixed with oil particularly. It is very hot, People who were working had to use some sort of tools. Their hands, you can use it a little bit afterwards, but otherwise we all had blisters and singe marks. And it was, when it accidentally splattered you, it was rather a painful event. Now, after that, once it's been covered with the resin, it has to be wrapped up. And linen bandages, we used fresh linen that had not been, that was old, wasn't old, and so you cut it into strips. And they used throughout Egyptian history different sizes of strips, but it depends very much on who you are, because we found if the same person's cutting a sheet of cloth, without thinking about it, you cut it at the same intervals. So again, you get very much the handprint of the individual artisan, and then you can sort of rip it up, and then you get your bandages, and then you wrap them. To make them longer, you just wrap, you tie this bandage with the next one in a knot, and again, the knots are very distinctive. Any of you have been Eagle Scouts or Boy Scouts or Girl Guides, whatever, you can see that certain knots, you can say, oh, I know who tied that one. And again, in mummies, in ancient mummies, you can tell that as well. Bandages must have been made well in advance. You must have had bandage rollers who would roll them up neatly. And in embalming caches, we have found often unused bandages that were meant for a particular mummy that were just placed in there. And here is the wrapping. Now, again, the resin plays a very key role because you want it to stick. And then we wrapped the mummy, brownie, and people were burning incense, and other people were reciting the right text, so that brownie was going to have a very nice afterlife, as you can see here. And the wrapping continues. The head is always very tricky. And you can see this is the completed brownie that looks rather similar to some of the other this one's in the Agricultural Museum, and it is indeed a sheep mummy. So you can see the similarity between the two and the positioning based on the sort of sphinx pose that is favored with them all. We didn't use any extra rope, such as the twine used in the ancient mummy, but brownie was looking quite good. We also, as you can see, had the fish and the rabbit. Sorry, not the rabbit, a cat. After that, we decided that we wanted to bury this because one of the questions that I wanted to deal with later on was to take the animal out and do DNA testing and other tests and unwrap it in order to see how it had survived. Now, this was all being done last year. We tried to give Brownie a good funeral. So we had our sistrum, we had our texts, we had our wailing and weeping. I know people look a bit too cheerful at this point. Bringing the animals into where they were being buried. You can please notice the very fine sistra that are being employed for the whole event. And we have our pet cemetery near our department. So everyone got to practice digging in the heat and to find out what it was like to be an ancient Egyptian and to labor in this particular way. What's very nice is one of them has had, their brownie has a cartonnage mask made. We were a bit low on funds, so it wasn't gilded, just painted yellow, as you can see often in the ancient world. And we carried out the opening of the mouth ceremony with people, again, reading the appropriate texts for this. And then they were ceremonially buried, all of these creatures. And there we were. Now, what did we learn from all of this? We did learn a lot more about how they were mummified. We learned about the different ingredients, why certain things might have been used, the natron bags, because it was much more efficient than just putting plain natron in. 180 kilograms is what we had. We actually needed 400 kilograms to do it properly. Keep it covered if you want it to do well. keep it well covered with natron, otherwise the insects get in. The amount of strength, physical strength needed by the embalmers was something I had never thought of before. But you really need these sort of muscle-bound people who are going to be lifting up your cows and your sheep. And the stomach, I almost dropped it because it was really very heavy, or all of the stomachs were very heavy. And I had never paid attention to the idea of how much you would have to empty the stomach contents and wash them out. So that was, again, something that was interesting. The stench, particularly, you know, if you were doing an apis bull, because with the sheep, you know, I was practically sticking my head in to make sure I got all the internal organs out. The smell is very intense, which is one of the reasons why probably the incense is constantly being burned. It keeps away the flies, and it makes you not want to vomit. Which is really not something appropriate to do when you're doing something sacred. The whole question about body fat, if you have a force-fed apis bull who's been overly fat, it's really going to be quite difficult to desiccate it, which is why it's not surprising that the few bulls that were found were really in such bad state, because they don't dry well if they are fat. So a good reason to remain slender is to be sure that your mummified body looks much better than anyone who's plump. And then I had a question, because in a lot of the texts that talk about mummification or embalmers' texts, you have these lists of alum. And I thought, why was alum used? Now, alum basically is very good for when you have a cut or a nick, you put alum on it. It's used for tanning, which makes it very logical for mummification, but I wasn't quite sure how they used it, so I didn't really use it with brownie, but I was puzzling over it, and so I bought some alum and I ground it up, and then the fish I just did last week, or finished last week, we put alum on the inside. We smeared the internal area where the cut had been made and everything with alum, and it actually stops any liquid from coming out, and it really staunches blood. So that was probably why the alum was being used. I'm still not 100% sure I need to use it on a mammal, but it seems to have helped in the overall deodorizing, disinfecting, and stopping of bacteria. And in fact, the fish, the other fish did get maggots, but this fish with the alum didn't get maggots in it. Of course, you know, I have to do a few more tests because it might have just been because it was better buried as well. But I think the alum contributed to its speedy and much more graceful desiccation. Now, components of an embalming area means you do need protection from weather, you need to pay attention to insects, you need to have some sort of guard around you, because of course when you've got rotting flesh, you're going to get, in addition to insects and other vermin, you're going to get dogs, you're going to get jackals, and you're going to get all kinds of other canid types wanting to go in. Unless Anubis is there to repel them, they're going to run off with your body parts. You do need some water when you're doing this whole situation, so they must have had large vats of water available and little tumblers to pour things in. So you have, of course, think of the economy of this, where you have lots of little boys employed running to and fro, bringing water and emptying it. And you have to just think of all the economic aspects with the water, with collecting the natron, then with grinding up the natron, with collecting the alum, mining it from Kharga Oasis and bringing it over, then grinding that up, sieving it. So these must have been really large industrial areas, maybe not necessarily quite closely connected with the embalmers. The embalmers could have purchased these, but this is all part of the economics of mummification, and particularly in the late period where you have millions of animal mummies, this would have been, you know, a thriving kind of economy. And of course importing resins, which you are getting either from the south or from the north or from both, because and also some of these animals, and we did this with the rabbits, were probably made with the equivalent of a turpentine enema using the oil of cedar or pine oil. And again, that would have been coming in from the Syria-Lebanon area. So really a huge amount of trade was dependent on people being mummified. You need a physical place to dry and clean the natron. And if you were an atelier or workshop, you really need a large area to do this with people with rakes or all hands just going, using their winnowing fans almost, to make sure that it dries properly. The anointing, the fumes from the resin were quite intense, and I'd always assumed this all happens inside, and I was wondering if it really did, because certainly people would begin to hallucinate with the amount of fumes and that they were inhaling, and it does make one cough and choke, and it would be interesting if one could actually look at the lungs of embalmers because of the amount of smoke they would have inhaled, but that's another thing. The wrapping also means that constantly people were drumming the streets and trying to collect all of the raw materials. Now, what we learn from the experimental mummification is really it leads us to experience things the way the ancients did, in a very physical way. And one can read all the texts we want, we can look at all the artifacts, but you don't understand until you do. And we are sometimes at the very beginning, in fact, of Egyptian history, learning how people made things, how they got their technologies right, as we ourselves learn to do them. So it's very much our being apprenticed to the ancient Egyptians in a very distant and peculiar kind of way. Obviously, by doing this experimental work, we have a much better understanding of the whole process and the resultant debitage, and needless to say, each mummification for me, or any other experimental work, I'm sure, for people who have done it, it leads you to new questions that you might have about these. Now, the future work that we are hoping to do is do DNA on our mummies. The rabbits have been DNA'd once already, 6 years after that, because I'm interested in seeing how the whole mummification process affects the DNA and whether the DNA breaks up. Because even now there are all sorts of human DNA experiments going on, but sometimes one wants to make sure that the rate of degradation. The alum experiment, which I mentioned, we actually did it, and it did work. We wanted to exhume and examine, more on that in a minute, and one has to constantly repeat these experiments with more controls. And I'm also interested in looking at working with oils and resins and testing them and seeing what kind of combinations might have been used. Gas spectrometry is the best way, and out of Bristol, Richard Evershed and his team have been doing a lot of work, and I've done some work with them, and we're hoping to do more. And we did find, of course, the higher oil to resin ratio produced more liquid black material for spreading, which also burnt the mummies, which also was very akin to what we get to votive mummies from the Greco-Roman period. Now, remember I said we wanted to do exhumation and examination. Well, last week I went to check on Brownie. This is not quite where we buried her. This is the head and part of the body. You can see here the neck, and this is what's happened. But what has happened to Brownie is that dogs and jackals, we're in the middle of the desert, have actually got in, and even 1 year later they were attracted by the smell, so they dug down and pulled it out and started to eat it. And we've got chew marks. And you know, with Egyptologists say, how do we know, how did the ancient Egyptians come up with the idea of mummification? And we always say, yes, either the wind blew away old bodies, eroded the graves and you could see the old bodies and they were exposed, or animals dug them up. And I was well, I no longer say that, because even a year or 5 years later, it seems that animals sometimes, when they are hungry enough, will dig up a tomb and pull something out that is covered with natron and drenched with resins and oils and eat it nonetheless. So it is an interesting thing, and perhaps that is why the ancient Egyptians started to work on artificial mummification after all. But we do have enough to still take samples and do some tests on it, and even this way the taphonomy of the whole experience is still interesting, because when you go to tombs now, sometimes we think it's great tomb robbers that have done this, where you find bits and pieces of bandages and bones scattered about, but quite often it is indeed animals that have done this. So in and of itself, that is an interesting thing to have learned. So you can see that Brownie is still delicious and we still need to do more research. So thank you very, very much for your attention. And now I will turn to the physical part of this. Now, obviously, because of practical considerations, it was not going to be... I still have 7 minutes. Okay, I'll be quick. Because of practical considerations, I couldn't make a mummy with you because we didn't really have 70 days and no one wanted to bring me over again because they thought once is more than enough. So what I thought we'd do is I had another question, was, you know how we keep finding alabaster in places and they talk about these alabaster bowls being used for blood sacrifice? I have a question, which is, does blood actually sink into the alabaster? Now this is Egyptian alabaster from Thebes, and it hasn't been treated with wax or anything the way that they do when they're selling them to the tourists. Do we have to wear gloves? Yeah. Okay. In ancient Egypt, we would not have been wearing gloves, or indeed anything made of plastic. However, we have some blood. Thank you, Jane. I'm going to pour it in and then pour it out. And I have to tell you, we unfortunately had, despite all the bubble wrap and everything else, it smashed. So it is more porous and permeable than it ought to be. Thank you, Reg, for putting it back together. There is a hole down here, though. But the idea is to see what happens when you put blood in here. So I'm going to put some blood in here now. Then I'm going to pour the blood out. Then I'm going to rinse it. Then I'm going to put more blood in, and we're going to see what happens. By that time, we will move this aside so Jeffrey can speak. So this is genuinely cow blood? Okay, so if we were at Abu Sir, you would have had this in one of the areas. You remember at Abu Sir, you have all of those alabaster vessels that people keep saying were for slaughtering cattle and to collect the blood. And I keep thinking, why? Think of the flies. Think of doing this in the height of summer, in outside, in Abu Ghurab. Obviously, that's the hole. This is not a magic trip. But it's actually quite thin. Did I not shake it enough? Most of the blood I've met with is a bit thicker. Oops, sorry. Good thing you had the plastic. Okay. Reddish, pinkish, no big deal. Will the super glue hold if I do this? Well, one way of finding out. This is rinsed, and there is absolutely no thing. Now, of course, how would we be rinsing something that is this big and this thick? You would have to have a lot of scrubbing. Were these vessels emptied out immediately, or was the blood allowed to sit? So what we're going to do now is I am going to put, I don't know if it'll sit because of the hole, but maybe if we put some plastic underneath it, it'll hold. Anyway, I'm going to put this, immerse it in blood, and later on today we will have a chance of looking at it to see if the blood stains the Egyptian alabaster or not, and that will help answer the question of these places that were supposed to be used for ritual storage of blood and blood offerings. Was this frozen?
No, it was fresh. I can guarantee that.
Sorry, sweetie, there seems to be a lump in here. That's right. Now remember, if we were doing this in real time, we would be getting fresh blood spurting out with no coagulation, because of course then how quickly will it coagulate? And in the sun what happens? Because when I've done butchery in Egypt, it does... Okay, maybe you don't want to watch this. No, you definitely don't want to watch this. Okay. Now I'm going to put this aside. Vilika, may I have your pen? I know it doesn't work. Thank you. This is the nature of experimental archaeology. It never goes as you think it ought to. Goody. I shall. We all like blood pudding. It's very delicious. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to leave this as it is for a while and see what happens. I'll do this, sweetie. Yes, let me cover it up. If you have it, I'd like to keep it and do more. No, I'm not allowed.
Thank you very much, Salima.
Oh, never mind. Sorry.
Are
I'm
you
happy
okay?
to take questions if there's time before
We
sharing.
have time for a couple questions if anybody has any. And I'll repeat the questions so that everybody can hear.
And I'll put these, where should I put these? No, for people to use. If they want to. If they want to finger up the natron and stuff, I'll put it over here. All righty. Okay. It becomes less and less effective. Of course, the earliest natron is less effective than the later natron. But what you have to do is you've got these gloopy bits, you have to beat it up a bit. And then you leave it in the sun. And if you sieve it again, it works very well. But you do need to sieve it. And when you feel the natron, you will just see how even when you do it for 2 seconds, it gets into your pores. Yeah, the fat, I mean, sometimes if it's really glooped, you just throw it away. So there will be a percentage of loss of natron from the early part of mummification.
Is there any indication of animals actually being specifically raised to use this stuff?
Yeah. They must have farmed them because I was working on various excavations with dog mummies, and the majority I have often found are younger animals. So I'm sure they were being raised, and it's easy to raise dogs and cats in particular. Raptors are a problem. Ibises are still relatively okay. So they must have had farms for them, and sometimes whether they were killed by poison sometimes or just by neglect, I don't know. And of course puppies and kittens die by themselves if they're not well looked after or if they're separated from their pet mothers. So yeah, there would have been farming, and that's something that we are in fact looking into to try and find places where these animals would have been farmed. No, I don't think so, because you can't see very well, and it's much more of a pain to not be able to see what you're doing and be lit by oil lamps. Plus, the sunshine helps the desiccation, and it also, the UV light is very good for making sure that disease doesn't spread. And although the Egyptians might not have known that it was UV light, it was the magic of Ra, or whatever it was, but they knew that it was better to have it desiccated quickly, because even the blood then dries out.
So the question was whether
they
would occur at night, and the answer is unlikely. We have time for one more?
Yeah, I'm just interested about how deep they are. I've never thought about how in terms of mummification, and you can check that. I know in the medieval period, sources around that protected.
Well, happily enough, since I work in Cairo Oasis, that is the main source of alum. The oases have a lot of alum. There is alum in the Western Desert in particular. Kharga has huge alum mines. We know they were worked in the Roman period and the 26th dynasty. And if you go to Luxor Temple, the Ramesside period, Ramses II wrote about all these different tributes coming in from all over. And in Kharga Oasis, they mention this sort of mineral, which we think is alum. And since alum is mined there, and it's obviously, we know the words for ochres, it wasn't the ochre that came from there that they were getting excited about, it was the alum. So that must have been the case. And if you use alum in dyeing as a mordant, as well as in leatherworking is similar to making a mummy, really, so it's quite logical. And you don't need that much if you're just coating the interior, and I'm trying to look at more text to see the percentage of alum versus the natron and other materials that are used, because the amounts that they say will give us a clue as to what exactly they were doing it and if I've reconstructed it correctly.
Thank you very much. I think that's all the questions we can take now. During the break, you can ask Salima more. And I'd like to thank you once again, Salima, for your presentation.
Oh, that's right, that's right. It's not over yet. We started off this morning with an experiment in progress to see the staining of blood on the beautiful artifact, the holy artifact indeed. And we now need to see the results of it.
Of course.
I don't know where it is, though. Ah, here it comes.
Stay there. Stay. You can all touch it if you like.
Right in the audience.
Right. So it's sticking out. Thanks, darling. Right, sorry to keep you longer, but we have to bear in mind, of course, that it's very cold here. So the blood is not behaving the way it would in Egypt, unless it was the dead of winter, because... But let's see what happened in something we had prepared earlier. It's like being a 5-year-old and having to put your mittens and gloves on. Okay. Oh, goody. So this is what we had done earlier, and our bowl has broken up, but you can see that the bud has completely congealed inside. Sorry, Kasia. Now, if I remove it, you can see that it's a nice pinky color. Do we have any water, chaps? Thanks. So, okay, yeah, sorry. You're also one of those. I don't want to put it down in case I do something yucky. And you can see that on the whole, it doesn't really stain it very much. And if it comes out like that, even if you left it, and maybe in the heat, it would coagulate much faster, you can just scoop it out. So you could, in fact, contrary to what I had first thought, use some of those basins that are in the sun temples and in other places. They might have been used as blood receptacles, and in fact, maybe because of the crystalline structure of the stone, they wouldn't be as absorbent except in cracks, which you could wash out. And I'm sure some dogs would come by and lick out all the blood at some point or the other, but you could scoop it out, which is quite nice to know. And now, maybe we could in fact have our flint snapper, who has made this beautiful knife. If he wants to do this, we can do it with flakes too, because we have a stake, so you can see how effective they are for cutting. You want to come do that?
I have to do that.
Well, you don't have to. I mean, I quite enjoy doing this. It's good to taste one. Is it so? Okay. Well, here, I'm going to use the flake. Beautiful flake. And you can use your beautiful knife.
Try it.
No, no. It will work. See? I don't know if you can see. It's just beautiful. Just cuts through. And in fact, even sushi chefs would be pleased to use this for $9.99 or less.
I think this would work more like a saw. I think this
Okay.
is pretty rough. Let's see.
Okay, this is rough, so we're going to give it a try. And you can hear it, in fact. Did you hear that? That wasn't the cardboard. That was the meat. But that, too, is very effective. So it is quite nice, but the only problem is when you use this, particularly with butchery, you have to keep retouching them in the initial stages, particularly when you're going through the leathery and the hide and the hair and so forth. But there you are. Would anyone like to try this later on? They can. Thank you very much.